If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We post new stories as often as possible, so if that is something you are into, please go ahead and tell the like button that you are installing a new home security system, but then set the passcode to a sequence of numbers that only appear in the like button's own dreams. Most of us view our homes as the ultimate sanctuary. It is the one place where we can close the door, lock the deadbolt, and believe that we are truly alone. We trust the floors beneath our feet and the walls that surround us. But for a 35-year-old project manager named Ben Miller, the very walls of his dream home were about to start talking back. Before we get into the terrifying discovery Ben made behind his living room wallpaper, I am curious where in the world you are catching this story today. Go ahead and leave a comment with your current location, especially if you are sitting in a room that feels just a little too quiet right now. Ben purchased the massive 4-bedroom estate on Elm Street in May of 2025. It was a beautifully renovated Victorian house in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. For Ben, who had spent most of his adult life living in cramped apartments, this house was the physical manifestation of his hard work. It had high ceilings, intricate crown molding, and a wraparound porch that seemed perfect for quiet summer evenings. However, the honeymoon phase with the house ended during his second week of residency. It started with a sound that Ben could not quite characterize. It was not the rhythmic thumping of a radiator or the predictable groan of a house settling into its foundation. At exactly 1:15 a.m. every single night, Ben would hear a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from inside the walls of his master bedroom. It sounded like something very small was trying to find its way out through the drywall. Ben, being a logical man, assumed he had a minor pest problem. He hired an exterminator who spent 3 hours crawling through the attic and the basement, but the man found nothing. No droppings, no nests, and no entry points for rodents. The scratching continued, and by June, it had evolved into something much more disturbing. One Tuesday night, while Ben was lying in bed trying to ignore the sound, he heard a distinct, wet, sliding noise. It was as if something large and heavy was being dragged through the narrow crawl space between the bedroom and the guest bathroom. Then came the hushing sound. It was a soft, human-like shush that lasted for 3 seconds before the house fell into a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Ben sat up in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and began to move through the house, checking every closet and every corner. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The doors were locked, the windows were shut, and the security system was armed. But as he passed the fireplace in the living room, his flashlight caught something strange on the wallpaper. There was a thin, vertical line running from the ceiling to the floor, almost invisible unless the light hit it at a specific angle. He stepped closer and realized it was not a seam in the wallpaper. It was a hairline crack in the plaster underneath. Ben reached out and pressed his hand against the wall. The surface did not feel cold and solid like the other walls in the house. It felt thin, almost hollow, and more unsettlingly, it felt warm. It was the kind of warmth you might feel if you pressed your hand against someone's chest. He leaned his ear against the crack, holding his breath to minimize any sound of his own. For a long minute, he heard nothing but the blood rushing in his ears. But then, from somewhere deep within the structure of the house, he heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a page being turned. It was followed by a tiny, muffled cough that was so clear it felt like it had happened right next to him. Ben scrambled backward, tripping over a coffee table and dropping his flashlight. As the light rolled across the hardwood floor, it illuminated the baseboard near the crack. Ben saw a tiny silver object lying on the floor that had not been there when he moved in. He picked it up and realized it was a small, heart-shaped locket. It was tarnished and old, but when he pried it open, he found a photograph of a woman and a young boy standing in front of the house on Elm Street. The woman was smiling, but her eyes looked terrified. On the back of the photo, a message was scrawled in faded ink that read, They are still looking for us. Keep the silence. Ben looked back at the wall, his hands shaking as he realized the Victorian renovation had been more than just cosmetic. Someone had built a secondary set of walls inside the original frame, creating a hidden, narrow world that ran throughout the entire house. He realized with a jolt of pure terror that the sounds he had been hearing were not coming from ghosts or pests. They were coming from someone who was still living inside the drywall, and at that very moment, Ben saw the vertical crack in the plaster begin to slowly, silently widen. Ben watched in frozen silence as the thin, vertical crack in the living room plaster began to expand. It was not a violent bursting of the wall, but a slow and deliberate parting of the material, as if the house itself were taking a deep, rattling breath. The warmth he had felt earlier was now radiating from the opening in a steady, humid wave that carried the scent of old paper and unwashed wool. As the gap reached the width of 2 inches, a pale, trembling finger emerged from the darkness within. It was a human finger, but the skin was so translucent that Ben could see the faint blue network of veins underneath. The finger traced the edge of the wallpaper, moving with a frantic, searching energy. Ben stood paralyzed, his mind racing through every logical explanation and finding none. He thought about the locket in his hand and the warnings scrawled on the back of the photograph. He realized that the renovation he had admired so much was actually a massive architectural lie. Someone had spent thousands of dollars to shrink the living space of this house, just enough to create a hidden labyrinth of hallways and rooms that were never meant to appear on any blueprint. The scratching sound he had heard for weeks suddenly intensified, erupting from 3 different points in the room simultaneously. It was no longer coming from just the living room wall. It was coming from the ceiling and from beneath the floorboards. The hushing sound returned, but this time it was not a single voice. It was a chorus of dozens of whispers, all merging into one continuous, vibrating hum that seemed to shake the very foundation of the Victorian estate. Ben realized that there was not just one person living in his walls. There was an entire hidden population, a silent society that had been watching him since the moment he signed the closing papers. As the crack in the wall widened further, Ben saw a pair of wide, unblinking eyes staring back at him from the shadows. They were the eyes of a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, but they possessed a hollow, ancient quality that suggested he had seen far too much of the darkness. The boy did not scream or beg for help. He simply placed a small, dirty hand against the edge of the plaster and pushed. The hidden door, disguised perfectly by the ornate wallpaper and crown molding, swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. Beyond the door lay a space that was only 18 inches wide. It was a vertical crawl space that stretched upward into the darkness of the second floor. The walls of this hidden passage were lined with hundreds of small, handwritten notes pinned to the studs. Ben leaned forward, his curiosity momentarily overriding his terror, and read the closest one. It said that the man in the blue shirt is eating cereal again. He looks lonely. The realization hit Ben like a physical blow. They had been documenting his every move, every meal, and every private moment from behind the safety of the drywall. Suddenly, a heavy, rhythmic thumping began to echo from the second floor, directly above where Ben was standing. It sounded like someone was striking the floorboards with a sledgehammer. The boy in the wall flinched at the sound, his face contorting in a mask of pure agony. He reached out and grabbed the sleeve of Ben's shirt, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, he pointed upward toward the master bedroom. Ben knew he should run. He should burst through his front door, get into his car, and never look back. But he felt a crushing sense of responsibility for the people trapped in the bones of his home. He thought about the sincerity he had always tried to bring to his work as a project manager, and he realized he could not ignore a structural tragedy of this magnitude. He took the flashlight from the floor and began to climb the grand staircase, his footsteps sounding like thunderclaps in the oppressive silence of the house. As he reached the landing of the second floor, He saw that the master bedroom door was standing wide open. The scratching sound was now so loud it sounded like a swarm of insects was devouring the room. Ben stepped inside and panned his light across the walls. The expensive, designer wallpaper he had chosen just a month ago was shredded. Long, jagged strips of paper hung from the ceiling like weeping willow branches. Behind the paper, the drywall had been systematically punctured with thousands of tiny, uniform holes. Ben walked toward the largest cluster of holes near his headboard. He pressed his eye to one of the openings and looked inside. He expected to see more hidden passages, or perhaps the woman from the locket. Instead, he saw a massive, complex system of pulleys and wires that snaked through the entire master suite. The wires were attached to small silver bells that were currently vibrating with a frantic energy. Then, the thumping sound returned, louder than ever, coming from directly behind the wall he was looking at. A section of the wall near the closet suddenly buckled inward. A massive hooded figure stepped out of the darkness of the crawlspace, its form so large it had to hunch over to fit under the ceiling. The figure was draped in heavy gray rags that smelled of wet ash and copper. It carried a long, sharpened iron rod that was stained with something dark and viscous. The figure turned its head toward Ben, and though its face was obscured by the hood, Ben could feel a gaze of pure, predatory intent locking onto him. The hooded figure raised the iron rod and struck the wall next to Ben's head, the force of the blow shattering the plaster and sending a cloud of white dust into the air. From within the hole, Ben heard a high-pitched, melodic whistling that began to rise in volume. It was a signal. All throughout the house, the scratching and the whispering stopped instantly. Then, from every corner of the room, the sound of hidden latches clicking open filled the air. Ben realized with a jolt of horror that he was no longer the owner of the house on Elm Street. He was the only person in the building who was currently standing on the outside of the walls, and the people on the inside were finally ready to trade places. The hooded figure stood motionless in the swirling white dust, the sharpened iron rod held with a terrifying, steady strength. Ben backed toward the bedroom door, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the shredded wallpaper and the thousands of tiny, uniform holes that now looked like unblinking eyes. The high-pitched whistling from the walls intensified, joined by the heavy, mechanical clanking of the pulley system. Throughout the house, the sound of hidden latches clicking open accelerated until it sounded like a frantic applause. Ben turned to run, but he stopped when he saw the hallway. The vertical seams in the drywall had parted completely. From the narrow, 18-inch gaps emerged more figures. They were not all like the giant in his bedroom. Some were skeletal and bent, their limbs moving with the jerky, unnatural precision of marionettes. Others were like the boy from the living room, pale and silent, their skin the color of parched parchment. They did not speak, and they did not scream. They simply moved into the hallway, reclaiming the space that Ben had thought was his own. He realized then that these people had not been trapped in the walls against their will. They had been bred there over generations, a shadow lineage that viewed the open rooms of the house as a dangerous, exposed wilderness. Ben scrambled toward the grand staircase, but the hooded figure from the bedroom was faster than its size suggested. It did not strike him with the iron rod. Instead, it used the tool to hook the collar of Ben's shirt, yanking him backward with a strength that felt like a hydraulic press. Ben fell against the wall, and to his horror, the plaster felt as soft as a sponge. The hidden population converged on him, their cold, translucent hands reaching out to pull at his clothes and limbs. They were not trying to kill him. They were trying to bring him inside. He felt himself being hoisted into the narrow crawl space behind the master suite headboard. The space was cramped, smelling of cedar and ancient dust. As he was pulled deeper into the skeleton of the house, he saw the woman from the locket. She was sitting in a small nook near the chimney stack, her eyes hollow, and her hands busy knitting a garment out of what looked like gray insulation fibers. She looked at Ben and placed a single bony finger to her lips. She gave him that same soft shush he had heard on his second week of residency. The hidden door through which he had been dragged swung shut, and the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the final sound Ben Miller ever heard from the outside world. He pressed his face against one of the tiny holes in the drywall, watching as the hooded figure began to peel away the shredded wallpaper in the bedroom. With meticulous care, the figure began to apply a fresh layer of neutral, modern paint to the walls, smoothing over the cracks and erasing any sign of the struggle. By sunrise, the master bedroom looked like a page from a high-end real estate magazine. A month later, a young couple stood in the driveway of the house on Elm Street, clutching a set of shiny new keys. They marveled at the Victorian architecture and the pristine, renovated interior. They commented on how peaceful and solid the house felt, a true sanctuary from the chaos of the city. As they walked through the living room, the husband remarked that he thought he heard a faint scratching sound, but his wife laughed it off, as the house simply settling into its foundation. Deep within the structure, Ben sat in the darkness of a 4-inch wide cavity, his back pressed against a cold wooden stud. He held the heart-shaped locket in his trembling hand, the metal now warm from his own body heat. He realized that the house had never truly belonged to the people whose names were on the deed. It belonged to the silence, and the silence was always hungry for new residents to keep its secrets. He leaned his ear against the back of the drywall and heard the new couple laughing in the kitchen, their voices sounding like a broadcast from a distant, unreachable planet. We often spend our lives building walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the most dangerous things are the ones we allow to grow in the spaces between. True security is not found in the strength of our locks, but in the courage to face the shadows we choose to ignore. It is a sobering thought to realize that every home has a history, and some histories are written in the hollow spaces we never think to measure. When we stop listening to the quiet voices around us, we might just find ourselves becoming a part of the very silence we once feared.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We cover at least 3 of these stories every single week. So, if that is something you are into, please go ahead and gently sabotage the like button's internet connection right before it tries to join an important meeting. Tonight, we are heading out to the high desert of Nevada, a place where the horizon stretches for 100 miles in every direction, and the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight on your chest. Most people who drive through this stretch of Highway 50, often called the loneliest road in America, are just trying to get from point A to point B as fast as their engine will allow. But for some, the desert is not just a place to pass through. It is a place where things that have been forgotten go to stay hidden. It was 2:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in middle of July, 2024. A man named Elias Thorne was driving his silver sedan toward the town of Ely. Elias was a long-haul surveyor, a man used to isolation, and he actually preferred the graveyard shift because the heat of the Nevada sun was enough to cook the brain of anyone foolish enough to work under it. The only thing keeping Elias company was the low hum of his tires against the cracked asphalt and the flickering glow of his dashboard. He reached over to his radio, hoping to find some classic rock or maybe a late-night talk show to keep his eyes open, but all he got was static. He twisted the dial slowly, listening to the white noise hiss through the speakers. Suddenly, the static cut out. It did not fade away. It simply vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute that Elias actually checked to see if his radio had lost power. But the small green light on the display was still glowing. The frequency read 99.7. Then, a voice came through. It was not the booming voice of a radio DJ or the frantic energy of an advertisement. It was a woman's voice. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of emotion. It sounded like she was reading a grocery list, but the words she was saying made the hair on the back of Elias's neck stand straight up. The voice said, "Sarah Miller, age 24, Reno. Departure scheduled for 4:12 a.m. tomorrow." Elias frowned, slowing his car down to 50 miles per hour. He thought it was some kind of weird indie radio play, or maybe a true crime podcast he had accidentally stumbled upon. He kept listening. The voice continued. Marcus Higgins, age 52, Carson City. Departure scheduled for 5:30 a.m. tomorrow. The voice went on, listing names and cities, followed by specific times. Elias felt a cold chill wash over him, despite the desert heat still radiating from the ground. There was something so mechanical, so final, about the way the voice said the word departure. Elias arrived in Ely a few hours later, checked into a cheap motel, and tried to shake the feeling of that broadcast. But curiosity is a persistent thing. The next morning, he sat in a local diner and pulled up a news app on his phone. He searched for Reno. The headline at the top of the page hit him like a physical blow. A 24-year-old woman named Sarah Miller had been killed in a hit-and-run accident in downtown Reno. The time of death reported by the police was 4:12 a.m. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He scrolled down further. In Carson City, a man named Marcus Higgins had suffered a fatal heart attack while preparing for work, unquote. The emergency call had been placed by his wife at exactly 5:30 a.m. Elias sat there, his coffee going cold, staring at the screen. This was not a coincidence. This was something else. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on his survey maps. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Elias knew he had to go back out there. He had to know if the radio station was still broadcasting. He got back into his car at 11:15 p.m. and drove 20 miles out of town, back toward the empty stretch of highway where the signal had been strongest. He tuned the radio to 99.7. At first, there was only the desert wind. Then, at exactly midnight, the silence returned. The same woman's voice began to speak. Her tone had not changed. It was still that chilling, monotone cadence. Linda Graham, age 60, Elko. Departure scheduled for 3:18 a.m. Elias gripped the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. He wanted to turn the radio off, but he could not move his hand. He felt like he was eavesdropping on the inner workings of the universe. The voice continued for several minutes, listing names of people across the state of Nevada, and then the voice said a name that made Elias's heart stop. Elias Thorne, age 38, Highway 50. Departure scheduled for 4:22 a.m. Elias slammed on his brakes, his tires screaming as the car skidded to a halt in the middle of the dark road. He looked at his watch. It was 12:40 a.m. He had less than 4 hours. 1. The panic set in instantly. He began to breathe in short, jagged gasps. He looked around the dark desert, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows or a pair of headlights coming at him. But there was nothing. Just the sagebrush and the distant, jagged silhouettes of the mountains. His first instinct was to call for help. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. But it was not a dispatcher. It was the woman from the radio. Departure scheduled for 4:22 a.m., Elias, the voice said through the phone. Please ensure you are ready. Elias threw the phone onto the passenger seat as if it had turned into a venomous snake. He put the car in gear and floored it. He decided he was going to beat this. He was going to drive as far away from this stretch of road as possible. If the broadcast said he would depart on Highway 50, then he just had to get off Highway 50. He drove like a madman, pushing the sedan to 90 miles per hour. He watched the clock on the dashboard. 1:15 a.m., 2 o'clock a.m., 2:45 a.m. The road seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how fast he drove, he did not seem to be passing any landmarks. The mile markers remained the same, or perhaps he was just too panicked to read them correctly. At 3:30 a.m., his engine began to sputter. He looked at his fuel gauge. It was on full. He had filled up in Ely, but the car was losing power. It groaned and shuddered, the lights on the dashboard flickering wildly. "No, no, no," Elias whispered, pounding on the steering wheel. "Not now." The car finally gave out and rolled to a stop. He was in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no houses, no other cars. Just the oppressive blackness of the Nevada night. He looked at his watch. 3:50 a.m. Elias got out of the car. He thought that if he stayed in the vehicle, he was a sitting duck. He started to run. He ran off the road, into the desert, tripping over rocks and tearing his clothes on the sharp desert scrub. He did not know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. At 4:10 a.m., he reached a small, crumbling shack. It looked like an old miner's cabin from the 1800s, half buried in the sand. He scrambled inside, huddling in the corner, his lungs burning. He stared at the glowing numbers on his watch. 4:15 a.m., 4:18 a.m. Somewhere in Elko, Linda Graham was departing. Elias closed his eyes and prayed. He thought about his life, about all the things he had put off, the people he had not called, the apologies he had never made. He realized that he had spent so much of his life just trying to get to the next place, never actually being present in the moment he was in. He had been so focused on his own isolation that he had forgotten how to truly live. 4:20 a.m. He heard a sound. It was faint at first, but it was growing louder. It was the sound of a radio. It was coming from inside the cabin. He looked over and saw an old, rusted transistor radio sitting on a wooden crate. It should not have been working. It had no batteries, and the wires were frayed and broken. But the green light was glowing. The woman's voice filled the small shack. "Elias Thorne," the voice said. "It is time." Elias looked at his watch. 4:22 a.m. He braced himself for a crash, for a heart attack, for a shadowy figure to emerge from the corner. But nothing happened. The world remained silent. Elias sat there for a long time, his eyes squeezed shut. Minutes passed. He slowly opened one eye, then the other. He looked at his watch. It was 4:30 a.m. He was still alive. He began to laugh, a hysterical, sobbing sound that echoed off the wooden walls. He had made it. The radio was wrong. It was just a prank, or a glitch, or some bizarre psychological trick played by the desert heat. He stood up, brushing the dust off his jeans. He felt a profound sense of relief, a second chance at life. He walked out of the cabin, intending to find his way back to the road and wait for a passerby. But when he stepped outside, the desert was gone. There was no Highway 50. There were no mountains. There was no sky. Elias was standing on a vast, endless platform of white light. In every direction, as far as he could see, there were people, thousands of them. They were all walking in the same direction, moving toward a horizon that seemed to hum with a soft golden glow. He saw a woman walking near him. She looked to be about 60 years old, wearing a nightgown. She looked peaceful, almost relieved. "Linda?" Elias asked, his voice sounding thin and distant. The woman turned and smiled at him. "Hello, Elias," she said. "You're right on time." Elias looked back at the cabin, but it was gone too. Everything he had known, everything he had been running toward or away from, was gone. He realized then that the departure the radio spoke of wasn't about the moment of death. It was about the moment of leaving the world behind. The accidents, the heart attacks, the breakdowns, those were just the doors. He had spent his final hours in a state of pure terror, fighting against the inevitable, only to find that the destination was not something to be feared. He had been so worried about the time he had left that he hadn't noticed he had already stopped living long before he reached the desert. The radio wasn't a warning to save himself. It was an invitation to let go. Elias took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He looked at the golden light on the horizon, joined the crowd, and began to walk. The signal for 99.7 still broadcasts out there in the high desert, but only for those who are traveling alone in the deepest part of the night. If you find yourself on Highway 50 and the static suddenly turns to silence, you might want to keep your eyes on the road. Or perhaps you should just listen, because sometimes the most important things in life are the ones we only understand when they are over. But that is a story for another time. There is a profound and unsettling illusion that we all buy into when we visit the great wilderness of the American continent. We pack our expensive gear, we bring our maps, and we stick to the well-worn trails, believing that because we paid an entry fee at a ranger station, the wild has somehow been tamed. We look at the towering mountains and the endless oceans of pine trees, and we see a postcard. But the wilderness is not a park. It is a living, breathing entity that is infinitely older and stronger than we are. It operates on its own set of rules, and it does not care about our sense of safety. Millions of people walk into these forests every year and walk out with beautiful photographs. But every so often, someone walks into the trees, steps just a few feet off the path, and is swallowed whole by the landscape, leaving behind nothing but baffling clues and a silence that haunts their families forever. Before we dive into one of the most perplexing vanishing cases in the history of the national parks, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the morning of October 12th, 1999. The autumn air in Yosemite National Park was crisp and biting, carrying the distinct scent of decaying pine needles and cold granite. Arthur Pendleton, a 34-year-old architect from San Francisco, had planned this weekend trip for months. He was an experienced outdoorsman who respected the mountains, and he wanted to pass that love of nature down to his 7-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a bright, energetic boy with a boundless curiosity about the world. He was wearing bright red hiking boots, a yellow fleece jacket, and carrying his own tiny backpack filled with trail mix and a plastic compass. They had chosen a moderately difficult trail near the Tuolumne Meadows area. It was a route Arthur knew well, offering stunning views of the valley below without being too treacherous for a young boy. They started their hike early, right around 7:30 a.m., when the morning mist was still clinging to the forest floor. For the first few hours, everything was absolutely perfect. They talked about the animals, they pointed out uniquely shaped clouds, and they took breaks to drink water and eat snacks. Leo was having the time of his life, running just a few steps ahead of his father, always staying within sight on the clearly marked dirt path. By early afternoon, the physical exertion was beginning to catch up with him. At roughly 2:45 p.m., Arthur decided it was time to take a long rest before making the final descent back to the parking lot. They found a clearing just off the main trail. It was a beautiful, serene spot, dominated by a massive, gray granite boulder that sat near the edge of a dense line of Douglas fir trees. Arthur took off his heavy pack and set it on the ground. He asked Leo to sit on a flat rock nearby while he got out their sandwiches. Leo, however, was mesmerized by a cluster of bright blue wildflowers growing near the base of the massive boulder. He asked his dad if he could go look at them. Arthur smiled, looked at the area, and saw it was perfectly safe. He told Leo he could look at the flowers, but he had to stay right by the rock and keep talking so Arthur could hear him. Leo skipped over to the boulder, his bright yellow jacket contrasting sharply against the gray stone. Arthur unzipped his backpack, rummaging through the compartments to find their water bottles and the sandwiches he had wrapped in foil that morning. He heard Leo humming a little song, the sound floating gently on the quiet mountain breeze. Arthur looked down into his bag for a few seconds. He moved a spare sweater, found the sandwiches, and pulled them out. The entire action took maybe 10 to 15 seconds. No more than 20. Arthur stood up, holding the food, and turned toward the massive boulder. Leo was gone. Arthur did not immediately panic. He assumed Leo had simply stepped behind the large rock to look at a bug or use the bathroom. Arthur called out his name, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet clearing. There was no answer. Arthur walked over to the boulder, expecting to see Leo hiding behind it with a mischievous grin. But when he rounded the massive stone, there was nothing. The ground behind the rock was covered in a thick layer of dry, crunchy pine needles. There were no footprints. There was no bright yellow jacket. A cold spike of adrenaline hit Arthur's chest. He called out again, louder this time. He yelled Leo's name with the sharp, commanding tone of a parent demanding an immediate response. The only sound that came back to him was the gentle rustling of the wind through the high branches. This is where the story takes its first, deeply unsettling turn. If a child wanders off in a forest, especially a forest floor covered in dry leaves and snapping twigs, they make noise. You can hear the brush moving, you can hear footsteps crunching, and if they fall or get scared, you can hear them cry. But Arthur heard absolutely nothing. It was as if a vacuum had descended over the clearing the moment he looked into his backpack. In a matter of 15 seconds, Leo had vanished completely, leaving zero acoustic footprint. Arthur began to run in frantic circles around the clearing, pushing his way into the thick tree line. He screamed until his throat was raw. He ran 50 yards down the trail, then sprinted 50 yards up the trail. The vast, indifferent silence of Yosemite was suffocating. By 3:30 p.m., blind panic had completely taken over. Arthur realized he was wasting precious daylight. He grabbed his backpack, abandoned the food on the rock, and sprinted down the mountain toward the nearest ranger station as fast as his legs could carry him. He reached the ranger outpost at 4:45 p.m. Breathless, sweating, and crying, he frantically explained the situation to the head ranger. Within minutes, the machinery of a massive search and rescue operation was set into motion. By 6 p.m., a team of 20 armed rangers and expert trackers were at the boulder where Leo was last seen. They set up a grid. They searched the immediate area inch by inch, looking for broken twigs, scuff marks on the rocks, or fibers from Leo's yellow jacket. The trackers were baffled. The dry pine needles around the boulder were entirely undisturbed. There was absolutely no physical indication of which direction the boy had gone. It was physically impossible for a child to move through that terrain without leaving a trace, yet there was none. As the sun began to set, the situation grew infinitely more dangerous. The temperature in the high Sierras drops drastically at night. By 8 p.m., it was near freezing. The search coordinators brought in specialized tracking dogs, bloodhounds trained to follow the faintest human scent over miles of difficult terrain. They gave the dogs one of Leo's unwashed shirts from Arthur's car. The dogs smelled the shirt, put their noses to the ground at the boulder, and began to circle. But then, they did something that seasoned dog handlers describe as highly unusual and deeply unnerving. Instead of picking up a trail and pulling at their leashes, the bloodhounds whined, tucked their tails between their legs, and sat down. They refused to move past the tree line. It was not that they lost the scent. Handlers will tell you that a dog reacting this way is indicating that the scent does not slowly fade away into the woods. The scent simply stops abruptly right at the rock, as if the person ceased to exist at that exact coordinate. The first night passed in agonizing darkness. Arthur sat at the command center, staring blankly at topographic maps, drinking coffee he could not taste, and praying for a miracle. By day 2, the search had exploded into a massive effort. Over 200 volunteers, professional mountaineers, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras joined the hunt. They expanded the search radius to 5 miles, then 10 miles. They checked every ravine, every cave, and every riverbank. The thermal cameras swept the forest floor at night, looking for the tiny heat signature of a little boy huddled in the cold. They found bears, they found deer, but they found absolutely no trace of Leo. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the weather suddenly shifted. A massive, unseasonal storm front rolled over the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and freezing rain began to pour, eventually turning into a heavy snowfall. The search had to be temporarily suspended. Arthur was forced to sit in a cabin, listening to the wind howl, knowing his young son was out there in the freezing whiteout conditions. Statistically, the chances of a 7-year-old surviving 4 days in the freezing wilderness with no shelter and no food were almost zero. When the storm broke on the morning of the 6th day, the search teams went back out, but the mood had shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The snow had covered any remaining tracks. The forest was buried in a foot of pure white silence. Then, on the afternoon of the 7th day, a bizarre radio call came into the command center. A group of elite mountain climbers were scaling a highly dangerous, near-vertical rock face known as the Devil's Tooth. This location was roughly 12 miles away from the boulder where Leo had vanished. More importantly, it was nearly 3,000 feet higher in elevation. The terrain leading to the Devil's Tooth consisted of brutal, jagged scree fields, deep icy rivers, and sheer cliffs. It was an environment that challenged even fully equipped adult professionals. One of the climbers was resting on a narrow ledge halfway up the rock face. He looked over to his right, and sitting neatly on a small, isolated outcropping of rock was a bright yellow fleece jacket. The climber radioed it in. The rescue team immediately dispatched a helicopter to the coordinates. A ranger was lowered down to the ledge. He retrieved the jacket. It belonged to Leo. The discovery sent shockwaves through the search command. How could a 7-year-old boy travel 12 miles through impossibly rugged terrain, cross freezing rivers, and scale a massive cliff wall in a matter of days? Furthermore, the jacket was not snagged on a branch or dropped in a panic. It was folded neatly, almost perfectly, and placed deliberately on the rock. The teams redirected all their resources to the Devil's Tooth. They combed the treacherous area for 2 more agonizing days. They found nothing else. No boots, no backpack, no boy. The location of the jacket made absolutely no logical sense. It defied all known patterns of lost children who typically walk downhill, follow paths of least resistance, and shed clothing haphazardly when they succumb to hypothermia. On the morning of the 10th day, the official search was quietly being scaled back. Arthur was a broken man. The life had been completely drained from his eyes. He was preparing to leave the mountain without his son, a reality that no parent can ever truly accept. Around 11:30 a.m. that day, a lone wildlife photographer was trekking through a densely wooded, swampy basin located about 5 miles in the exact opposite direction of the Devil's Tooth. This area had already been thoroughly searched by dogs and men on the 2nd day. It was a miserable, muddy place filled with thick brambles. The photographer was setting up his tripod when he heard a strange, soft sound coming from a massive, fallen redwood tree nearby. The tree trunk was hollowed out by rot. He approached cautiously, thinking it might be a wounded animal. He peered into the dark cavity of the log. Huddled as far back as possible, trembling violently but breathing, was Leo. The photographer immediately radioed for emergency medical evacuation. Within an hour, Leo was airlifted to a regional hospital. Arthur was rushed to his son's bedside. When Arthur saw Leo, he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. His son was alive. It was a miracle that defied every law of nature and medical science. But as the doctors examined Leo, the miracle quickly morphed into a profound and terrifying mystery. Leo was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but he was alive. However, the physical evidence of his ordeal did not align with reality. Leo was not wearing his bright red hiking boots. He had no socks on. Yet, the soles of his bare feet were completely pristine. There were no cuts, no scratches, no bruises, and no dirt ground into his skin. He had supposedly wandered for 10 days through miles of brutal, jagged rocks, thorny brush, and freezing snow, completely barefoot, yet his feet looked as though he had just stepped out of a bathtub. Furthermore, his clothes, a simple long-sleeve shirt and jeans, were completely dry and entirely clean. There were no mud stains, no grass stains, and no tears in the fabric. He did not smell like a boy who had been living in a wet, rotting log. When the police and child psychologists carefully interviewed Leo a few days later, hoping to understand how he survived and how his jacket ended up on a sheer cliff 12 miles away, Leo's answers sent a deep chill through everyone in the room. Leo explained that he had walked behind the boulder to look at the blue flowers. When he reached out to touch one, a sudden, incredibly thick fog rolled into the clearing out of nowhere. He said the fog was so thick he could not see his own hands. He called out for his dad, but his voice sounded like it was stuffed inside a pillow. Then, Leo said, a man walked out of the fog. But when the psychologist asked what the man looked like, Leo hesitated. He said the man looked like a person, but he was covered in thick, dark fur like a bear, and he had eyes that looked like shiny black stones. Leo said the furry man did not speak with his mouth, but Leo could hear the man's voice inside his head. The voice told him not to be afraid, and that the fog was rising like a flood, and they needed to go up high to stay dry. Leo claimed the furry man picked him up. Leo said the man moved incredibly fast, so fast that the trees blurred together like a painting. They went high up onto a cold rock, where the man told Leo to take off his jacket because the bright yellow color would attract bad things in the sky. Leo neatly folded his jacket and left it there. Then, Leo said he fell asleep in the furry man's arms. When he woke up, he was inside the dark log. The man was gone, and Leo waited there because the voice in his head told him a man with a camera would come to wake him up. The authorities gently pressed Leo, suggesting he had a bad dream, that he had perhaps imagined the furry man to cope with the fear of being alone. But Leo was adamant. He never wavered from his story. The police eventually closed the case, officially listing it as an incredible survival story of a lost child. But off the record, the search and rescue veterans who worked that mountain will tell you that the official report is a lie. They will tell you that a 7-year-old boy cannot survive 10 days in a freezing blizzard. They will tell you that a boy cannot walk for miles without shoes and have flawless feet. They will tell you that the wilderness holds ancient, inexplicable things that do not abide by the laws of our reality. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It speaks to a very quiet, very profound truth about our existence. We move through life with a fragile sense of control, believing that our careful planning and our modern tools can shield us from the unknown. But life is incredibly fragile, and our safety can be dismantled in the span of 15 seconds. It is a harsh lesson in consequences. A single moment of distraction, a brief turning of the head, can alter the trajectory of a life forever. It teaches us about the deep, silent patience of the natural world, a world that watches us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We must walk through life with a sincere respect for the forces that are greater than us, understanding that we are simply guests in a domain that we will never truly conquer. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned mining town where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a deeply rooted American dream of leaving everything behind. When the stress of modern life, the noise of the city, and the crushing weight of daily responsibilities become too much, people often fantasize about packing up their car and moving to the middle of nowhere. They believe that if they can just find a quiet piece of land deep in the mountains, they can start over. They believe the wilderness will wash away their problems. But the wilderness is entirely indifferent to human struggles. It does not heal you. It only amplifies whatever you bring into it. If you walk into the deep woods carrying paranoia, fear, and unresolved darkness, the isolation will not cure you. It will consume you. This is the tragic and deeply unsettling reality of a family who drove up into a remote mountain range looking for peace, only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of clues that are so bizarre they defy all logical explanation. Before we unpack one of the most baffling and chilling unsolved mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2009. Bobby Jameson was 44 years old, and his wife, Sherilyn Jameson, was 40. They lived in the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma, along with their beautiful 6-year-old daughter, Madison, and their small pet dog, a mixed breed named Maisie. On paper, they looked like a normal family, but behind the closed doors of their home, their lives were slowly unraveling. Bobby had recently been involved in a severe car accident that left him with chronic, debilitating back pain. To manage the pain, he was prescribed heavy medication, which profoundly altered his mood and energy levels. Sherilyn struggled with her own severe bouts of depression and bipolar disorder. As the medical bills piled up and their physical and mental health deteriorated, the family became increasingly isolated. They stopped talking to their neighbors. They pulled Madison out of public school. The walls of their home seemed to be closing in on them. In the months leading up to October of 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn began exhibiting behavior that was deeply alarming. They started telling the few people they still spoke to that their house was haunted, but they were not talking about simple bumps in the night. Bobby seriously claimed that there were hostile, invisible spirits living on the roof of their house. He became so consumed by this delusion that he actually went to a local pastor and asked him if there was a specific type of bullet he could buy that would allow him to shoot and kill ghosts. Sherilyn, feeding off this shared paranoia, went out and purchased a .22 caliber handgun, claiming they needed to defend themselves against the entities that were stalking their family. Driven by this overwhelming fear and a desperate desire for a fresh start, the Jamesons decided they needed to move. They wanted to buy a 40-acre plot of land deep in the San Bois Mountains, near the even smaller town of Red Oak, Oklahoma. It was a rugged, heavily wooded, and isolated area. They planned to buy a shipping container, place it on the land, and live completely off the grid, far away from whatever they believed was hunting them. On October 8, 2009, the family prepared to leave for a short trip to view the land. But before they left, their home security camera captured something that would later become a cornerstone of this terrifying mystery. The camera was pointed at their driveway, recording the family as they packed their white pickup truck. The footage is incredibly disturbing to watch. It is completely silent, but the visual alone is enough to make your skin crawl. For over 2 hours, Bobby and Sherilyn are seen walking back and forth from the house to the truck. They are carrying completely mundane items, but the way they are moving is entirely unnatural. They are walking with a stiff, mechanical gait, almost like zombies. They walk past each other dozens of times in the narrow driveway, but they never make eye contact. They never stop to speak to each other. They just move back and forth in a bizarre, silent trance, their faces entirely devoid of emotion. Later that day, they loaded Madison and the dog into the truck and drove away, heading east toward the mountains. 9 days passed. On October 17th, a group of local hunters were riding their all-terrain vehicles deep in the Sans Bois Mountains. They were navigating a narrow, deeply rutted dirt path that was miles away from any paved highway. The terrain was incredibly rough, flanked by dense timber and steep ravines. As they rounded a bend, they saw a white pickup truck parked awkwardly on the side of the dirt trail. The hunters stopped their vehicles. They recognized the truck immediately. They had driven past this exact spot a few days earlier and had seen the truck sitting there. The fact that it had not moved in days in such a remote area was highly unusual. They walked up to the vehicle to see if someone needed help. The truck was locked. The hunters peered through the dirty glass of the windows. The inside of the cab was a mess of clothing, maps, and wrappers. But then, they saw something moving in the back seat. Curled up on a pile of jackets was Maisie, the family dog. The dog was severely emaciated, trembling, and barely clinging to life. She had been locked inside the freezing, airtight truck for over a week with absolutely no food or water. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the hunters immediately called the local sheriff's department. When the police arrived, they had to physically break the window to get the dog out and unlock the doors. Maisie was rushed to an animal clinic where she miraculously survived. But as the investigators began to inventory the contents of the truck, the situation escalated from an abandoned vehicle case into an absolute nightmare. Inside the truck, the police found Bobby's wallet, containing his identification and credit cards. They found Sherilyn's purse. They found both of their cell phones. They found the family's global positioning system unit, which showed that they had driven further up the mountain, stopped, and then driven back down to this specific spot before turning the engine off. They found the heavy winter coats the family would have desperately needed in the freezing autumn mountain air. But the most shocking discovery was located underneath the driver's seat. Tucked away in a bank bag was $32,000 in pure, hard cash. The investigators were completely baffled. If the family had been robbed, the criminals would have certainly taken the massive sum of money. If they had simply gotten out of the truck to go for a short walk and gotten lost, why did they leave their dog locked inside the vehicle to slowly starve to death? Why would they lock the doors behind them? And why would they leave their heavy coats inside when the temperature outside was rapidly dropping? A massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Over 100 volunteers, police officers with tracking dogs, and men on horseback scoured the rugged terrain surrounding the truck. They combed through the dense brush, checked the deep ravines, and searched the abandoned coal mines that dotted the landscape. The tracking dogs caught a faint scent leading away from the truck, but it quickly vanished into the wind. They searched for days, expanding the radius further and further out. They found absolutely nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed the three of them whole. As the detectives dug into the evidence left inside the truck, they made a deeply unsettling discovery on one of the cell phones. It was a photograph of 6-year-old Madison. The picture appeared to have been taken somewhere on the mountain, likely on the day they disappeared. In the photo, Madison is standing with her arms crossed over her chest, but it is her expression that haunts anyone who looks at the image. She is not smiling. She looks incredibly distressed, as if she has been crying, and her eyes are looking slightly off camera, staring at someone or something with a look of pure fear. It was the last known photograph of the little girl alive. The sheer lack of physical evidence led to a chaotic storm of theories. Some investigators believed that Bobby and Sherilyn, caught in the grip of a shared drug-induced psychosis, simply wandered off into the woods and succumbed to the elements. The area was notoriously dangerous, filled with steep drops and wild animals. But this theory could not explain why they would lock the truck, leave the money, and condemn their beloved dog. Others theorized that they had stumbled across a drug manufacturing operation. The Sans Bois Mountains were known to be a hiding place for illegal methamphetamine labs. If the Jamisons had accidentally walked onto a cartel's territory while looking for land, they might have been executed to protect the secret. But again, ruthless criminals do not typically leave $32,000 in cash sitting under a seat. Another terrifying theory suggested a murder-suicide plot. Did the intense paranoia finally push one of the parents past the breaking point? Did they force their family to march out into the freezing wilderness to end it all? But without bodies, and without a weapon found in the immediate area, the police had nothing but empty speculation. The case officially went cold. For 4 years, the mystery of the Jamison family haunted the state of Oklahoma. Then, on November 16th, 2013, the silence of the mountains was finally broken. Another group of hunters were trekking through a deeply isolated section of the forest, roughly 3 miles away from the spot where the white pickup truck had been abandoned 4 years earlier. This specific area had not been thoroughly searched during the initial investigation because it was extremely difficult to access and incredibly far for a 6-year-old child to walk through dense, thorny brush. One of the hunters noticed something pale contrasting against the dark autumn leaves. As he walked closer, the horrifying reality of what he was looking at came into focus. Lying on the forest floor were the skeletal remains of 3 human beings. The police were immediately notified. The medical examiner arrived at the scene. Because the bodies had been exposed to the harsh elements and scavenging animals for 4 years, there was very little physical evidence left. But the arrangement of the remains told a silent, tragic story. The 3 skeletons belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. They were found lying face down, side by side, perfectly parallel to one another. The medical examiner took the remains back to the laboratory for a thorough analysis. The bones were heavily weathered. They could not determine the exact cause of death for Sherilyn or Madison due to the severe decomposition. There were no broken bones to suggest a fall, and no obvious knife marks. However, when they examined Bobby's skull, they found a small, mysterious hole. The coroner could not definitively state whether the hole was caused by a bullet from a small caliber weapon or if it was the result of animal activity over the years. Because the evidence was so degraded, the official cause of death for all 3 members of the Jameson family was ruled as undetermined. The discovery of the bodies only deepened the terrifying mystery. How did they get 3 miles away from their truck? The terrain was brutal. If they were lost and freezing, basic survival instincts dictate that you stay near your vehicle, which provides shelter. Why did they walk purposefully into the deepest, most unforgiving part of the woods? And why did they lay down side by side? If they were forced out there by someone else, why lay them out so methodically? If it was a murder-suicide, where was the weapon? The .22 caliber handgun that Sherilyn had purchased was never found inside the truck, and it was never found near the bodies. Did one of them use it, and then an animal carried it away? Or did someone else walk away with it? The truth of what happened on that cold October day remains buried in those mountains. But the most terrifying explanation is the one that forces us to look inward. The Jamesons were running away from invisible ghosts. They were running away from the suffocating pressure of their failing health, their financial ruin, and the demons taking root inside their own minds. When they locked the doors of their truck and walked into the dark, silent forest, they brought that paranoia with them. It is entirely possible that in the grip of an intense, shared psychological breakdown, the rustling of the wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. The shadows of the branches looked like the entities they believed were hunting them. Driven by blind, absolute terror, they abandoned their vehicle, abandoned their money, and forced their daughter to march deeper and deeper into the wilderness to escape an enemy that did not exist. When exhaustion and the freezing cold finally overtook them, they laid down together, holding onto each other as the darkness closed in. This tragic story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It speaks to a profound truth about human nature. We spend so much energy trying to outrun our problems. We change our jobs, we move to new cities, and we dream of escaping into the isolation of nature, believing that a change of scenery will bring us peace. But physical distance cannot cure an internal wound. The shadows we refuse to confront in the daylight will inevitably follow us into the dark. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the absolute necessity of facing our struggles directly. It reminds us that sincerity, patience, and the courage to ask for help when our minds begin to fail us are the only true ways to survive. The isolation they sought did not protect them. It simply provided a quiet, empty stage for their deepest fears to become a devastating reality. Life requires us to stand our ground and deal with the broken pieces of our lives. Because the further we run into the unknown, the harder it becomes to ever find our way back. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park, only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a specific kind of terror that belongs only to the deep woods in the dead of winter. It is a quiet, suffocating kind of fear. When the sun drops behind the trees and the temperature plummets, the landscape changes from a peaceful escape into a merciless trap. If you make a mistake out there, the elements do not care about your intentions. They do not care if you are a good person. They only demand that you survive. But what happens when 5 young men, who have no business being in the mountains, abandon a perfectly working vehicle in the middle of a snowy road and willingly walk into the pitch-black, freezing wilderness? Before we dive into that, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was Friday, February 24th, 1978. In the quiet, close-knit communities of Yuba City and Marysville, California, 5 young men were buzzing with excitement. They were Ted Viher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias. Ranging in age from 24 to 32, these men were inseparable friends. They all lived at home with their parents, and they all shared a profound, innocent love for the game of basketball. They played on a local team called the Gateway Gators, a team sponsored by a local vocational program. The very next day, Saturday, they were scheduled to play their first game in a week-long tournament. The winner of the tournament would get a free week in Los Angeles, a prize that felt like an absolute dream to these 5 men. They had laid out their uniforms on their beds. They had asked their parents to wake them up early. They were ready. But on that Friday night, they wanted to watch a college basketball game. UC Davis was playing against Chico State. Jack Madruga owned a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, a car he treated like his most prized possession. He would never let anyone else drive it, and he kept it in pristine condition. Around evening time, the 5 friends piled into Jack's car and drove south from Yuba City to Davis, California, a drive of about 50 miles. The game was everything they hoped for. It was loud, thrilling, and full of energy. When the final buzzer sounded around 10 p.m., the group left the gymnasium and got back into the Mercury Montego. They drove a short distance to a local convenience store in downtown Chico. The clerk working that night remembered them clearly. They were loud, happy, and polite. They bought some Hostess cherry pies, lemon pies, chocolate bars, and a few cartons of soda. The receipt showed it was slightly after 10:30 p.m. They got back into the car. All they had to do was drive straight south down the familiar highway, back to their warm beds in Yuba City to rest for their big game the next morning. But they never made it home. When Saturday morning arrived, the parents of the 5 men woke up to find their sons' empty beds. The uniforms they had laid out the night before were untouched. Panic set in immediately. These were not men who stayed out all night, drinking or partying. Some of them had mild intellectual conditions, and Gary Mathias managed a treatable psychiatric condition. They relied heavily on the structure of their homes and the comfort of their families. For all 5 of them to vanish without a word was completely out of character. The families started calling each other, realizing that none of the boys had returned. They immediately contacted the local authorities. If this were happening today, someone might have dialed 911 the moment they felt something was wrong. But back then, they frantically dialed the local police station to report them missing. The police initiated a search, retracing the route from Davis back to Yuba City. They checked the highways, the ditches, and the local hospitals. They found absolutely nothing. Days ticked by. Sunday passed. Monday passed. The community was paralyzed with worry. Then, on Tuesday, February 28th, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the mystery. A forest ranger was driving up a remote, treacherous dirt road in the Plumas National Forest. This road was roughly 70 miles away from Chico, and it was in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It went high up into the mountains, far away from any major highway or town. The road was unpaved, deeply rutted, and covered in snow. As the ranger navigated a steep, winding curve, he spotted a turquoise and white Mercury Montego abandoned on the side of the road. It was Jack Madruga's car. The police rushed to the scene, expecting the worst. But when they examined the vehicle, the situation made absolutely no sense. The car was sitting in a few inches of snow, slightly off the main ruts of the road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of a struggle. The gas tank was a quarter full. When a mechanic eventually checked the engine, he found that the car started up immediately. It ran perfectly. Even stranger, the tires were not stuck. 5 grown men could have easily pushed the car back onto the firm gravel with a few minutes of effort. Inside the car, police found the wrappers from the snacks the boys had bought at the convenience store. They found neatly folded maps in the glove compartment. The keys were missing, which suggested Jack had locked up his beloved car, but one of the windows was rolled down, letting the freezing winter air blow into the cabin. The most terrifying realization for the police was the location. The Plumas National Forest in February is an unforgiving place. The elevation is high, and the temperatures at night drop well below freezing. The 5 men were not dressed for the mountains. They were wearing light jackets, sneakers, and casual clothes. Why would they drive 70 miles out of their way, up a terrifying pitch-black mountain road, only to abandon a perfectly functioning car that could have served as a warm shelter? Why did they walk into the dark, freezing woods instead of simply turning the car around or sleeping inside until morning? The search and rescue teams scoured the woods surrounding the car. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and men on horseback. But a severe winter storm moved into the mountains shortly after the car was found, dumping several feet of fresh snow over the entire area. The dogs lost the scent. The helicopters could not see through the dense canopy of trees and the blinding snow. The search had to be called off. The families were left in an agonizing limbo, wondering if their sons were freezing somewhere in the dark, calling out for help that would never come. As the investigation continued, a man named Joseph Shawns came forward with a story that sent chills down the spines of the detectives. Joseph told police that on the exact night the boys went missing, he had driven up that same mountain road to check on a cabin he owned. Around 5:30 p.m., his car had gotten deeply stuck in the snow just a short distance past where Jack's Mercury Montego was eventually found. Joseph tried to push his car out, but while doing so, he experienced severe chest pains. Believing he was having a heart attack, he crawled back into his car, turned on the heater, and lay there in agony, hoping someone would drive by. Hours passed. It was incredibly dark and eerily quiet. Then, around 11:30 p.m., Joseph saw headlights coming up the road behind him. He looked out his window and saw a car park roughly 50 yards away. It was a turquoise and white car. He saw a group of people get out. They were standing around the car, talking. Desperate for help, Joseph opened his door and called out to them. He yelled that he was having a heart attack and needed assistance. What happened next makes the blood run cold. The moment Joseph called out, the voices completely stopped. The people standing around the car instantly went silent. A moment later, the headlights of the turquoise car were turned off. The silence of the mountain returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Joseph lay there in the dark, terrified and confused. Why would they ignore a man pleading for help? Why would they turn off their lights and hide? A few hours later, Joseph claimed he saw flashlights moving in the trees, and he called out again. Once again, the flashlights immediately clicked off, and the woods went dead silent. Eventually, Joseph's car ran out of gas. By some miracle, he survived the night and managed to walk 8 miles down the mountain the next morning, until he found a lodge where someone helped him. He never saw the boys again. If Joseph's story was true, it implied that the 5 men were terrified of something. They were hiding. But hiding from what? Or who? Months went by. The brutal winter slowly gave way to spring, and the thick layers of snow in the Plumas National Forest finally began to melt. In early June, a group of motorcyclists were riding on a remote trail deep in the mountains, about 19 miles uphill from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came across an old, heavily weathered Forest Service trailer. It was a shelter used by rangers during the summer months. As the motorcyclists approached, they noticed a pungent, unmistakable smell radiating from the trailer. One of the front windows had been broken. A motorcyclist stepped up, peered through the shattered glass, and immediately backed away in horror. Inside the trailer was a bed. On the bed lay a body wrapped tightly from head to toe in 8 heavy blankets. Police were called to the scene. When they unwrapped the blankets, they identified the body as Ted Wire. The scene inside the trailer was one of the most baffling and heartbreaking things the seasoned detectives had ever witnessed. Ted had not died of unnatural trauma. He had starved to death, and he was suffering from severe frostbite. His feet were badly damaged by the cold. Judging by the growth of his beard and his drastic weight loss, the coroner determined that Ted had lived inside that trailer for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks before finally passing away. He had suffered in that freezing, dark box for months. But the tragedy of his death was overshadowed by the baffling environment around him. The trailer was stocked with survival supplies. There were heavy winter coats, boots, and warm clothing folded neatly on shelves. None of them had been worn. There was a propane tank outside, connected to a heater inside the trailer. All Ted had to do was turn a valve to have a heated room. The valve was never turned. Most disturbing of all, there was a storage locker inside the trailer that contained enough freeze-dried food and military rations to keep all 5 men alive and fully fed for a year. The locker was sitting right next to the bed where Ted died. A few cans of food had been opened and consumed, apparently using an Army surplus can opener that belonged to Gary Mathias. But the vast majority of the food was completely untouched. Ted had literally starved to death while sleeping next to a mountain of food, and frozen to death while surrounded by fuel, fire starters, and heavy coats. Why didn't he eat? Why didn't he turn on the heat? The strange clues did not stop there. Sitting neatly on a table inside the trailer were Ted's leather shoes, his wallet with cash still inside, a gold ring, and a gold necklace. And near the door, investigators found a pair of sneakers. They belonged to Gary Mathias. This meant Gary had been inside the trailer with Ted. He had taken off his sneakers and, presumably, put on a pair of heavy boots from the trailer's supply before leaving. But where did he go? Why did he leave his friend behind? The search teams intensified their efforts in the woods surrounding the trailer. What they found only added to the nightmare. The remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found roughly halfway between the abandoned car and the trailer. They were located on opposite sides of the logging road. Based on the condition of their remains, investigators deduced that they had succumbed to the freezing temperatures on the very first night. They had literally frozen to death while trying to walk the 19 miles up the mountain. A few days later, a searcher found a skull and some clothing scattered near a thicket of bushes not far from the trailer. Dental records confirmed it was Jack Hewitt. But Gary Mathias was never found. His sneakers inside the trailer were the last trace he ever left on this earth. Extensive searches covering miles of dense forest yielded absolutely nothing. No clothing, no bones, no clues. He had simply vanished into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The investigation slowly ground to a halt. There was no evidence of foul play, no sign of an attacker, and no logical explanation for anything that had happened. The authorities theorized that the men had somehow taken a wrong turn in Chico, gotten lost, and ended up on the mountain road. Perhaps they hit a snowbank, panicked in the dark, and believed the car was permanently stuck. When they saw Joseph Shawns calling for help, perhaps they thought he was a threat, or they were simply too frightened by the strange situation to respond. They abandoned the safety of their car and started walking. But why walk uphill? Why walk deeper into the freezing forest instead of downhill toward the safety of the valley? The prevailing theory is that they saw the distant lights of a Forest Service cabin, or thought they were on a different road altogether. As they trudged through the deep snow in their light clothing, the brutal cold began to take its toll. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling fell behind and quietly passed away in the snow. The remaining three, Gary, Ted, and Jack Hewitt, managed to reach the Forest Service trailer 19 miles away. Once inside, they broke a window to get in. In the pitch-black darkness, terrified and freezing, their logic completely broke down. They did not realize how much food was in the locker. They were too scared to touch the propane valve, perhaps fearing an explosion. Ted's feet were so badly frostbitten that he could not walk. Gary and Jack Hewitt stayed with him for a while, opening a few cans of food to keep him alive. But eventually, as weeks dragged on and Ted grew weaker, Gary and Jack Hewitt realized they had to go get help. They left the trailer. Jack Hewitt did not make it far before the elements claimed his life. Gary Mathias took a different path, perhaps trying to find a road or a town, and walked deep into the unknown until he, too, was swallowed by the forest. Ted, unable to move, waited in the dark trailer for his friends to return. He waited for weeks. He waited until his body simply could not endure any more pain, and he quietly passed away, entirely alone. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark reminder of the fragile line between safety and disaster. It shows how a single, unexplainable decision, taking a wrong turn on a dark night, can lead to irreversible consequences. The universe does not offer second chances to those who wander into its harshest domains. It is completely indifferent to our innocence, our hopes, and our fears. For the families of the 5 men, the pain of not knowing the exact truth was a burden they carried for the rest of their lives. They had to live with the agonizing reality that their sons suffered in the cold, calling out for families who could not hear them. It teaches us a grim lesson about the limits of our control. We can plan our lives, lay out our clothes for tomorrow, and dream about the future. But sometimes, despite our best intentions and our purest hearts, the dark unknown reaches out and pulls us away, leaving nothing behind but questions that will never be answered. The American Dyatlov Pass remains one of the most baffling and heartbreaking mysteries in modern history. The woods up in the Plumas National Forest still hold their secrets, buried under decades of snow and silence. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a seemingly normal house in a quiet neighborhood and a hidden room that contained a secret so dark, the police officers who found it immediately requested counseling. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a very specific, undeniable dread that comes with staying in an old hotel. When you walk down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with identical wooden doors, you are walking through a gallery of hidden histories. You swipe your keycard, push open the heavy door, and drop your bags on the floor, rarely stopping to think about who was in that exact room the night before. You do not think about the arguments that echoed off the wallpaper, the quiet tears shed into the pillows, or the tragedies that might have unfolded just inches from where you are about to sleep. Most hotels clean away the physical evidence of the past, leaving only the scent of industrial bleach and fresh linen. But some buildings are too saturated with darkness. No amount of bleach can wash away the heavy, suffocating energy of a place that has seen too much pain. The Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles is one of those places. Before we unlock the doors to one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the winter of 2013. A 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lam had decided to take a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She was from Vancouver, Canada, and she was looking for an adventure. Elisa was a bright, curious, and expressive young woman who documented her life heavily on the internet. She maintained a blog where she wrote about art, fashion, and her personal struggles. She was navigating the difficult transition into adulthood and wanted to see the world on her own terms. Her trip brought her down to Southern California, and she needed an affordable place to stay in the heart of Los Angeles. She found a hostel called Stay on Main. What Elisa likely did not realize was that Stay on Main was simply a rebranded section of the infamous Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, the Cecil was originally designed to be a luxurious destination for wealthy travelers and businessmen. But when the Great Depression hit, the hotel fell on incredibly hard times. The surrounding area, known as Skid Row, became heavily populated by the transient, the desperate, and the forgotten. The Cecil slowly transformed into a cheap, long-term boarding house. Over the decades, it earned a deeply sinister reputation. It became a magnet for tragedy, serving as the final residence for numerous people who chose to end their lives. It was the temporary home to infamous serial killers who walked through the ornate lobby with blood on their hands, unnoticed by the staff. The building was a massive, towering monument to human suffering, holding nearly 700 rooms connected by a labyrinth of confusing hallways, dead ends, and dimly lit corridors. Elisa checked into the hotel on January 26th. Initially, she was placed in a hostel-style room with several other young female travelers. But within a few days, her roommates went to the front desk and complained about her behavior. They said she was acting erratically, leaving passive-aggressive notes on their beds and locking them out of the room. The hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room on one of the higher floors. Elisa was very close with her parents back in Canada. She called them every single day of her trip to check in and let them know she was safe. But on January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel and travel to her next destination, the phone call never came. Her parents waited. They called her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, panic had completely set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Because the area surrounding the hotel was notoriously dangerous, the police took the report very seriously. They dispatched officers to the Cecil Hotel to conduct a search. They knocked on the door of Elisa's private room. There was no answer. When they used a master key to enter, they found a scene that made absolutely no sense. All of Elisa's belongings were still in the room. Her luggage, her clothes, her laptop, and most importantly, her medication were all sitting there. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment to grab a cup of coffee and intended to return immediately, but she was gone. The police began a massive search of the massive, confusing building. They walked down every hallway. They knocked on doors. They brought in specialized search dogs to sniff the corridors. The dogs tracked her scent through the hallways, up to a certain window, and then the scent completely vanished. The police even checked the roof of the hotel. They found that the heavy metal doors leading to the roof were securely locked and heavily alarmed. If anyone tried to open those doors, a loud siren would immediately sound at the front desk. The alarms had not been tripped. There was no trace of Elisa Lam. 2 weeks passed. The story of the missing Canadian tourist hit the local news, but the police had zero leads. It was as if the sprawling, dark hotel had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. Then, in a desperate attempt to gather information from the public, the police released a piece of security camera footage captured inside one of the hotel elevators. They hoped someone might recognize her or notice a clue they had missed. Instead, the video became a viral sensation of pure, unadulterated terror. The footage is deeply unsettling to watch. It is silent, grainy, and stamped with the date February 1st. It shows Elisa walking into the elevator. She is wearing a red zippered hoodie, a casual shirt, and dark shorts. She steps inside, casually leans forward, and presses a column of buttons. She does not press just one button. She presses a series of them, right down the middle row. She steps back and waits for the heavy metal doors to close. But the doors do not move. They stay completely open. Elisa steps forward and looks out into the hallway. Her movements are sharp, jerky, and deeply strange. She peers out to the left, then to the right, moving her head with a bird-like paranoia. She suddenly jumps back into the elevator and presses herself flat against the wall, hiding in the corner as if she is terrified that someone or something is coming down the hallway to get her. A few moments pass. The doors still refuse to close. She steps out into the hallway again. This time, she does a strange, square dance-like step. She steps out, steps back in, steps out again. She is looking at something, but the camera angle only captures the interior of the elevator and a small sliver of the hallway. Whatever she is looking at is just out of frame. She walks out into the hallway, standing just to the left of the open elevator doors. Then she begins to move her hands and arms in a bizarre, unnatural way. She twists her wrists, waving her fingers in the air as if she is treading water or casting a spell. Her hands contort and bend. She is clearly interacting with someone or something, but she is completely alone. Finally, she turns and walks away, disappearing down the dark hallway. The moment she is out of sight, the elevator doors finally, quietly, slide shut. The release of the video sent the public into a frenzy. Millions of people watched it, offering countless theories. Some believed she was being pursued by a killer who was standing just outside the camera's view, holding the elevator button to keep the doors open. Others pointed to the dark history of the Cecil Hotel, suggesting she was interacting with a sinister, invisible entity. Her unnatural hand movements and sheer terror seemed to defy any logical explanation. While the internet analyzed every single frame of the tape, a completely separate and horrifying situation was unfolding inside the hotel. Guests staying at the Cecil began calling the front desk with highly disturbing complaints. They said the water pressure in their rooms had dropped to a mere trickle. When they tried to take a shower, the water that came out of the showerhead was completely black. It looked like dark, muddy sludge. As the water ran, the color would eventually clear up, but the smell remained. The guests complained that the tap water smelled pungent, sweet, and metallic. When they brushed their teeth or drank from the sink, the water tasted putrid and completely foul. The complaints grew so numerous that the hotel management could no longer ignore them. On the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker was dispatched to investigate the plumbing. He took the elevator up to the top floor and used a secure stairwell to access the roof of the building. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and gravel. Sitting on top of a raised platform were 4 massive cylindrical water tanks. These tanks supplied the water for the guest rooms, the showers, and the kitchens below. They were huge metal structures, standing over 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The maintenance worker climbed a metal ladder to the top of the platform. He walked over to the first tank. He reached down and unlatched the heavy metal hatch that covered the opening at the top of the tank. He lifted the heavy lid, leaned forward, and looked inside the dark, echoing chamber. Floating face up in the water, inches from the top of the tank, was the decaying, naked body of Elisa Lam. The worker scrambled backward in absolute horror. He immediately called the authorities. When the police and fire department arrived, the sheer logistics of the scene completely baffled them. The opening of the tank was so small, and the body was so swollen from being submerged in water for nearly 3 weeks, that they had to physically cut a hole in the side of the massive metal tank to drain the water and retrieve her remains. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. The guests inside the hotel realized with absolute terror that for the past 19 days they had been bathing in, brushing their teeth with, and drinking the water that contained a decomposing human body. But the horror of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the impossible mystery of how she got there. The police had checked the roof during their initial search, and the doors were locked and alarmed. To get to the roof without triggering the siren, someone would have had to navigate a complex labyrinth of fire escapes on the exterior of the building, climbing up several stories in the pitch-black night. Furthermore, the water tanks were towering structures. There was no fixed ladder leading from the concrete roof to the top of the specific tank where she was found. To look inside, you had to climb onto a platform, then haul yourself up the slippery, curved metal side of the tank. Once at the top, you had to lift a heavy metal hatch. Inside the tank, police found the red hoodie, the shirt, and the shorts Elisa had been wearing in the elevator video. They were floating in the water alongside her. The public immediately suspected murder. It seemed physically impossible for a petite young woman to navigate the fire escapes, scale an 8-foot water tank, open a heavy metal lid, strip off her clothes, jump into the water, and somehow close the heavy lid behind her. It seemed obvious that someone had chased her down the hallway, murdered her, carried her to the roof, and dumped her body into the tank to hide the evidence. The medical examiner took weeks to conduct a thorough autopsy and toxicology report. When the results were finally released, they provided an explanation that was far more tragic and realistically terrifying than any ghost story or murder plot. The autopsy revealed zero evidence of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Furthermore, the toxicology report came back completely clean. There were no illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. However, the toxicology report did reveal something incredibly important. The levels of her prescribed medication in her bloodstream were extremely low. Elisa Lam suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Her condition required strict, daily medication to keep her brain chemistry balanced. When she traveled to Los Angeles, the change in routine, the stress of traveling alone, or perhaps a personal decision led her to stop taking her medication as prescribed. When a person with severe bipolar disorder stops taking their medication, they can fall into a deep, psychotic, manic episode. During these episodes, the brain begins to misfire. The person can experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete break from reality. They might believe they are being hunted. They might believe they have to hide. The haunting elevator video was not a recording of a woman interacting with a ghost or a killer. It was a tragic recording of a young woman trapped inside a terrifying hallucination created by her own mind. The reason the elevator doors did not close was not due to an invisible presence. In her frantic button pressing, she had hit the door hold button, which forces the elevator to stay open for 2 minutes. She was waving her hands and talking to a threat that felt entirely real to her, but existed only in her fractured consciousness. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, she fled the elevator. She navigated the confusing hallways of the Cecil Hotel. She found an open window or a fire escape door that bypassed the roof alarms. Driven by the intense delusion that she needed to hide from her unseen pursuers, she climbed the exterior of the building. She scaled the water tank. She opened the heavy lid and climbed into the water, seeking the ultimate hiding spot. Once she was inside the tank, the water was freezing cold. Hypothermia sets in very quickly in dark, cold water. As the body core temperature drops dangerously low, people often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. The brain becomes so confused by the cold that it suddenly registers extreme burning heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down. She removed her clothes. But the most terrifying realization of all was the water level. When she entered the tank, it was likely over half full. But the tank was essentially a giant metal barrel with smooth, slippery walls. There was no ladder on the inside. As the morning approached and the hotel guests woke up, they began to turn on their sinks and take their showers. As they used the water level inside the tank slowly began to drop. Elisa would have been treading water in the pitch-black darkness, shivering uncontrollably. As the water level sank lower and lower, the opening at the top of the tank moved further and further out of her reach. Her fingers would have scraped desperately against the slick metal walls, finding absolutely nothing to hold on to. She was trapped in an echoing, freezing, dark metal cylinder, screaming for help that would never come, until sheer exhaustion finally pulled her beneath the surface. The lid on top of the tank was likely never closed behind her. The initial reports of the maintenance worker finding the lid closed were corrected during the investigation. He had found the lid open exactly as she had left it when she climbed inside. The story of the Cecil Hotel and Elisa Lam leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound tragedy that strips away the comforting myths of monsters and ghosts, replacing them with the raw, devastating reality of mental illness. It teaches us a subtle, vital lesson about the immense vulnerability of the human condition. A person can be completely surrounded by hundreds of people in a massive hotel located in the middle of one of the most populated cities on Earth and still be entirely, hopelessly alone. It reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying places are not always found in the basements of old buildings or at the end of unlit hallways. Sometimes, the most inescapable prisons are built inside our own minds, waiting quietly for a moment of imbalance to lock the doors. Life requires us to be truly observant, to look past the surface of those around us, because we never know the terrifying battles someone might be fighting in the quiet isolation of their own reality. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.